Let's get rowdy.
Hey guys, I'm going to welcome you back to the Rob Griffin Show. I am here with you, your host, on a podcast where truth will live. There will be zero hypocrisy here and none of that bullshit you see on the mainstream media. And today we have a really unique topic. We're going to be talking about cold cases. Now, as many of you already know, I'm a retired police detective. I was a cop in Henderson, Nevada, which is right next door to Las Vegas, Nevada. And so many people watch crime TV nowadays, right? They see TV shows like The First 48, and the whole premise behind The First 48 is if you roll up to a homicide and you're actually on scene, there's this magic window of opportunity. They call it the first 48 or the first 48 hours to develop some type of probable cause or some type of evidence that would lead you towards a particular defendant or suspect or whoever committed this crime, right? So cold cases, unfortunately, they happen quite frequently. You know, believe me, go Google search cold case murders of your city where you live. And they happen quite frequently. And I was not immune to that. I was able to be arriving on scene. In fact, I think he's a lieutenant now, but a good friend of mine by the name of Brett Seacats rolled up to a double murder that we had in Henderson, Nevada. This was a pretty gnarly one, folks. Like, whoever this offender was shows up at a residential house, kicks in the front door, shoots mom who's on the couch watching television, goes down the hallway and murders a teenage boy in his sleep while he's on his bed asleep, goes down the hallway and realizes they're out of ammunition and it literally beats the living crap out of this young female who lived in the bedroom in the back, the sister, the daughter of the mom. And unfortunately, she lived. But anyway, they flee the scene. My buddy Seacats arrives. This mom actually dies in his arms because she was shot bad and bleeding really bad. And I show up later and I'm sitting on that crime scene literally for, I don't remember shit, 16 to 18 hours. And I'll maybe talk about that later in another episode. But cold cases happen, right? And sadly, many times they go unsolved. And so I have a good friend of mine. He is a retired police officer of 30 years experience. My good friend, Mr. Mike Nesker, was from the Green Bay Police Department. I'd like to welcome him to the show. So, Mike, welcome to the show, buddy.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, I'm glad we got our comms worked out really good there. And so you tell us a little about your history. I know you were an officer for a long time, but you also do some teaching too, right?
Yeah, I started in police work in 1993. I'm from the Milwaukee, Wisconsin area. I worked for the Brookfield Police Department from 93 to 97, and then got hired by the Green Bay Police Department in 1997. I was just looking to work for a bigger agency, but I was all in when it came to law enforcement, education, training, and I ended up getting a master's degree in 2000, and that's when I started teaching part-time. And then I had thought of going to law school, but a good friend of mine who's a prosecuting attorney told me I shouldn't go to law school because I was too smart. So I ended up getting a grant to pay for a doctoral degree, which I finished in 2020. But I started teaching in 2000, and then I discovered this ability to write quite well. So I wrote a couple of books, and one of them happens to be a book on cold cases that happened right here in Green Bay. But what makes them unique is that they're very old. They're very historic.
Okay, so I know a little bit about cold cases, but not digging up. And when I say cold cases, my stuff are relatively recent. In fact, this is a crazy story, which I happen to share for another episode. I actually had a attempted homicide that I rolled up to as a detective, meaning I got there after all the shit had already hit the fan. And the young lady was searching cold case files for Las Vegas Metro when she got shot. So kind of irony there. But anyway, so you have a decorated career. I love what you're doing with the education piece. Did you do the bulk of your time in patrol, or did you ever do like detective work?
I was a detective for a year in Brookfield, and then I left that year to come up to Green Bay. And then I actually spent my entire career in patrol. I finished as a road supervisor for approximately 3 years, spent 10 years on a tactical team, but I really enjoyed being the first on scene. I wanted to be on the streets. Having a caseload of 35, 30 plus cases I never found that very thrilling. And for the year I was a detective, I realized how frustrating it was when cops would do crappy reports or half-assed. And you really learn to appreciate the value of good patrol work when you serve as a detective. And I enjoyed the streets and actually worked on the power shift from 7 p.m. to 3:30 in the morning for nearly all of my career because I would teach during the day. And then I spent my last 3 years on day shift. And I always made fun of day shifters until I realized how darn busy they were. And finished as a road supervisor, a patrol sergeant. And those are some of the best years of my career.
Well, I could tell you, I never really, to your point, I never wanted to test. I didn't actually even want to promote because I liked being a cop. I like doing investigation. And then, so a lot of my buddies, in fact, one of the guys I went to the academy with, shout out to you, Isaac, he's now deputy chief. I just didn't want to promote. I enjoyed being the tip of the sword. I wanted to be the guy that arrived and handled business. And so I applaud you for that, sir. So kudos to you. So when we got connected through my good friend, Kevin Raish, also a former Wisconsin police officer. I know you guys have probably heard Kevin's story on previous episodes, but he was telling me about you. And when we had our little conversation, you mentioned to me about a cold case. Now tell us a little bit about how this story started. I think it started with a relic that was displayed in the lobby of the Green Bay Police Department.
Yeah, at the police department in downtown Green Bay, we have a little museum, and it's actually on the second floor. And there's a glass case of a bunch of historic stuff, weapons, radios, technology. And there was this 1931 Tommy submachine gun. And I had asked about that machine gun. And I was told it was given to us by the Wisconsin Bankers Association after a robbery that occurred on the southwest side of our city. And one of our cops had been shot, and the case had never been solved. And for the longest time, it was believed that the bolt on the Tommy submachine gun had been welded back because the chamber was open in the display. So I asked if I could take a look at it, and I went to the University of YouTube and got my Tommy submachine gun armorer's license. And I learned a little more about the Tommy submachine gun thanks to YouTube. And I pulled back on the slide and it slammed forward, and I couldn't believe it, and discovered that it takes a 45 ACP round, put a couple of rounds in the 30 round clip or magazine, and pulled the trigger, and sure enough, it fired. And I was the first person to fire it in over about 50 years. We would later discover the ejection port, one of the springs in the ejector was bad, and we a friend of ours, a friend of mine, who I think every police department has. I'm sure you had some friends like this who they are gun collectors. They name their guns. They're that weird. And yeah. And he was able to fix it for us, and that thing rocks and rolls like it was brand new. So I then wanted to learn more about the case, and I would quickly discover that all of the original police department records from the case had been destroyed. But since I'm a good researcher, I started researching this particular cold case, and it occurred in 1931. I picked it up in 2004-ish, researched it for over a year, and to ultimately cultivate a suspect and find eyewitnesses who were still alive and actually get the suspect identified via an eyewitness.
No, wait. So do you do like a little 6-pack, like what we used to? So for the audience who don't know what a 6-pack is, if we develop PC on a suspect, we would get 6 people who look similar to them, and we have to put them. Basically, it's a lineup, but it's on paper, and you would take it to a witness and say, "Here, pick out the guy, circle him and initials." Is that how you did it?
Well, I wish I had done it that formally, but considering the case was 70 some years old at the time, I had generated a suspect and I was able to get some good booking photos from the historical archives in the FBI. And I brought the 91-year-old man back to the scene of the crime. It had changed a lot since it originally occurred. He took me right to the spot where he was standing. He described the suspect to me, and everything was matching up. And I actually, I still kind of get the chills a little bit when I recall this story. And after he told me the story, after he told me what he saw, and I opened up this binder I had with my suspects in it, and I flipped the page to the suspect, and this man, through his 91-year-old eyes, turned and looked at me and said, "Officer, I think you got him." And that was a pretty cool moment. And I had generated other circumstantial evidence that led me to believe I knew who did it. And it was this 91-year-old man that affirmed all the work I had put in for over the past year.
Man, that's an incredible story. We're talking 70 years later. And
Yep.
so obviously a six-pack's not warranted for a case of this magnitude, but the initial understanding was that there was a different suspect, right? So the media, or at least what I found online, is that they thought John Dillinger did it. Is that correct?
Yes. And John Dillinger, who is a very famous gangster from the Prohibition era, had a girlfriend up here in Green Bay. Her name was Evelyn Frechette. And he would come to Green Bay often to a place called Blackbeard's Tavern, and that was right next to the bank that got robbed. So for the longest time, even members of the Green Bay Police Department believed it was John Dillinger. So I ran with John Dillinger, and I figured, okay, if they believe it's John Dillinger, I'm either going to prove that it was, or I'm going to prove that it wasn't. So that was the first place I began to look. I chased down leads, and I utilized FBI historical archives. And what I discovered is John Dillinger was actually in prison on the day of this robbery. So there was no way he could have committed it. So then I eliminated John Dillinger as a suspect. And then, well, that's where the story, I guess began.
Well, that's probably about as good an alibi you can get, right? If you're incarcerated,
Yeah.
It's kind of hard to say that you were on scene. Now, so all I know is kind of briefly what you told me. I know there was a bank robbery. I was reading a little online that obviously somebody was shot. Can you tell me? Obviously, they went in, they robbed the bank. But there was a homicide involved as well. Is that correct?
Well, there was a homicide, but thankfully it wasn't one of the officers who was killed. So this happened on July 20th of 1931. And the suspects had entered the bank. There were 4 of them. And there were actually 7 suspects total, but not all of them entered the bank. And they were very violent. And this particular gang, who we'll talk about later, was known for their violence. And some witnesses had called the police department and reported the bank robbery. But the way the report was given led the officers to believe that the robbery was over. And back then, they didn't have radios. All they had were call boxes. All they had were telephones. They didn't have 911. And 4 officers responded in one vehicle. And the vehicle was like a 1930s Chevy Coach. It wasn't even marked. And
Wow.
2 of the people of the 4, one was the chief of police, and at the time he was 65 years old. Another was a guy named Lieutenant Gus Deloy, and he was 45 years old. And the chief of police, his name was Chief Hawley. And the 3rd officer is a patrol officer. The 4th one is also an officer, but he serves as the department mechanic as well. They roll up on the bank. They believe it's over, and they're met instantaneously with Tommy submachine gun fire. If anybody knows anything about a Tommy submachine gun, again, it fires a .45 caliber round. It can fire approximately 50 rounds in about 4 seconds. And as you can imagine, the officers were very startled. And Deloy is in the front passenger seat. He raises his right forearm to protect his face. And 3 rounds go through his forearm. 1 goes into his right eye and embeds between his eye and his brain. And then he gets himself out of the car, collapses, and a civilian grabs him and drags him into an alley on the south side of the bank. So he's out of the fight. The police chief, again, 65 years old, with a shotgun versus Tommy submachine gun. He gets behind a tree, starts returning fire. Another patrol officer with a .38 caliber, he gets into the vestibule of a doorway to the south side of the bank. He starts returning fire. He actually hits one of the gangsters, and that gangster was later believed to be dead and found on the west side of the state in a ditch near the Minnesota-Wisconsin border. So I'll pause there. What follow-ups do you got for me?
Okay, I had no clue it was this violent, and I knew the officers were taking rounds, and for the record, I have shot a Tommy machine gun. One of my buddies in college actually had one of those things, and we used to go out to the lake and shoot turtles. Sorry, turtles. But it's a very powerful machine gun, and if you've ever seen what a .45 caliber round can do to a human being, it's not something you want to get hit with. It's a pretty gnarly round.
I agree.
Yeah.
So Deloy.
Go ahead. No, ahead. Please continue. Go ahead.
So Deloy gets dragged into a civilian car, and the civilian drives him to St. Mary's Hospital, which at the time was on the east side of our city. And St. Mary's still exists today, but it's on the west side. And he would have his eyeball removed in about a 30-minute procedure. Now, again, you're talking 1931 medical technology, but they couldn't get the bullet out. So the bullet remains in his head. And again, it's like behind his eye socket, but before his brain. And doctors would later credit his forearm for saving his life because it had slowed down the path of the bullet. So Deloy ultimately gets a fake eye. He gets a glass eye. Now, to kind of give you an idea of what Deloy was like, August Deloy was a former Chicago firefighter, becomes a Green Bay police officer, gets shot in the head now at 45 years old. And you would think an officer, bullet in his head, one eye, in 2023 would probably retire on a physical disability. Nope, not Deloy. He ends up finishing a 49-year career. He works into his 60s. He never takes a sick day. And he finishes this 45, 47-year career and with one eye. He was also very well known for his jocularity. He would pop his eye out in front of people just to freak them out. And there was actually a homeless guy in the city at the time who also had a glass eye. And anytime his eye would fall out, he'd come to the police department because Deloy would help him put it back in. So Deloy ends up with this illustrious career. You know, he's known as an Iron Man, that's for sure. And then Hawley goes on to serve as for the chief of police for 49 years and ends up becoming the Guinness Book of World Record holder as the world's longest serving police chief. So just when you thought Green Bay was known only for the Packers, Wisconsin was only known for cheese, well, here we have a Guinness Book of World Record holder and a guy who gets shot in the head and goes on to finish a 47, 49-year career at the Green Bay Police Department. But if that weren't enough, Robert, in 1929, Deloy is part of another case. It's called the Triangle Gang. And he's a detective at the time involved in the takedown of this gang, which was an extortion case. Patrol officers want to be involved in the takedown, but they never tell Deloy. So it's the middle of the night, far east side of our city, and Deloy is in this field watching for the gang members to arrive to pick up the extortion money, and then they're going to be involved in taking him into custody. Patrol officers on the opposite side of the field, who Deloy doesn't know about, are also waiting in the weeds. Well, the patrol officers see Deloy. They think he's the extortionist. They run him down while they're running after him. Now, Deloy's running because he thinks he's being chased by the extortionists. And he gets shot over 70 some times with buckshot and collapses on the front porch of a farmer's house. And then the officers realize, holy shit, we just shot one of our own cops.
Okay,
He
so
gets all those.
that's crazy. So I don't mean to cut you off, but like, so people think, does this really happen where cops actually shoot cops? So friendly fire is not uncommon, especially in detective type work. In fact, when I was a detective, we had a service. I'm not sure if you use the same thing in Wisconsin. It was called LA Clear. And so if I were working a narcotics investigation for this, 123, Main Street, I would have to call it in to LA Clear to deconflict, to make sure we weren't both showing up on the scene, because in law enforcement over the years, we've had several cops killed by friendly fire because of mistaken identity, just exactly what you were just explaining.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And deconfliction didn't exist back then. As a matter of fact, you sometimes would have the patrol division and the detective division, who would want to get all the credit for a particular case. And instead of sharing information, they would keep information close to their chest. And so Deloy gets all these buckshots removed from him in 1928. And then 3 years later gets shot again. And you think that would be enough to get you to retire? Hell no. He keeps working. Pensions didn't exist as they did back then. And, the only retirement you would typically have is what you would end up in your savings account, for goodness sakes.
Wow.
So Deloy ends up keeps working. And this case never gets solved. And then there was a police chief back in the early 70s, and this is a whole nother story. And my wife and I picked up another cold case from the era that we hope to write about soon. But he makes this decision to destroy all of the records from the 1800s up until about the early 1970s because they just didn't hold value. So that's why our investigation ended up being microfilm, ended up being talking to people on the streets, press releases to locate witnesses, and then just doing archive research, which ultimately, became an absolutely fascinating story.
Okay, so the word on the street was that Dillinger did it. I know the name Dillinger. I don't know his whole story, but there was a movie that they made about him. I think Johnny Depp played that part, and I think you told me you were in the movie as well. Is that correct?
Yeah. So the movie called Public Enemies, has been created, and you can look that up online, and you can maybe even watch it. And I ended up becoming an extra in that film. And they were here in the Oshkosh area, which is just south of Green Bay, at the EAA Museum, and filming. And they were looking for extras. Well, apparently I was selected in part because I was short. And Johnny Depp, who was not very tall, was involved in a scene where he's being led from an airplane to an awaiting squad car. And the historical part of this scene is where he was arrested and in Iowa, I believe, and was being flown back to the original jurisdiction that had put out the warrant, and then being led to an awaiting squad car. And I was a plainclothes detective. And if you pause the movie, Robert, at just the right moment, you can see my big head, my big ears. And but I had the opportunity to be on the set for 10 hours, to be right alongside, Johnny Depp in that particular scene. And as you can imagine, the movie cameras make people seem larger than life. And Johnny Depp is not very big. He's quite the wiry person. But for me to be investigating this historic cold case, and then to have this opportunity kind of put it all together.
That's cool. I know what that's like. I was actually an extra in a movie just recently. It's called The Actor, by the way. Listeners, if you're going to go Google it, it just came out. It's called The Actor. Make sure it's a 2023 version. And you'll see this ugly mug appearing as an officer on the scene of a homicide. And I was just an extra. not really a big speaking part, but you'll be able to see this big ugly mug. I just went to the opening literally a couple of weeks ago, so I kind of know what that's like. So at some point, right, you decide to go, hey, I don't think this is Dillinger. You start digging. Tell me a little about that process and how you came up with who our suspect actually was.
Well, that process was very painstaking because we did not have access to police reports, and we only had access to news media accounts, which were then on microfilm. We had access to contemporary media, so we put some news stories out looking for any witnesses in the area that would be connected to Deloy, that would be connected to Hawley, that would be connected to any police officer that was working on that particular day during that particular era. And we then started studying bank robbery gangs that existed during the era. And as you know, that was the era of prohibition or shortly after it. And we stumbled across a gang at the time who had a very similar method of operation. So as you know, or as many of your listeners may or may not know, when you lack physical evidence, you can begin to look at circumstantial evidence. So we started studying the methods of operation of these particular gangs, of these bank robbery gangs at the time. And bank robberies then were very lucrative. In the Green Bay case, they got away with $10,000. And in today's day and age, if you pull a bank robbery, you don't get anything near that. And I think $10,000 is worth about $200,000 today from that era. So we started looking at methods of operation and plotting them out on a map. And we discovered a gang that was in the St. Paul, Minnesota area who was pulling bank robberies in the Midwest, Wisconsin, Michigan, Minnesota. And we discovered this pattern. And the pattern was very telling. And the pattern, for example, would typically involve 7 bandits, as they called them, or gang members, and always using Tommy submachine guns. And some of them would use other automatic pistols. They were very well dressed, and they were known for being very well dressed. They would wear 3-piece suits. They were all Italian looking. They all had dark complexions, and they would not hesitate to shoot their way out of their communities. So they were known for getting in gunfights with the police, and they could care less about the impact that those gunfights would have. And the vehicle they would drive was typically called a Nash, and the Nash was a very well-known vehicle then, but bank robberies liked the Nash at the time because it had a very roomy interior. And some of the gangs, including the one that was discovered, they would actually mount a Tommy submachine gun on a turret inside the Nash. So they would have like 360-degree fire.
Wow, that's crazy.
Yeah.
As a first responder, no, I don't even know, but did cops have bulletproof vests back in those days? I don't think they did they?
No, absolutely not.
Wow. Yeah, that's a gnarly scene to roll up to, man. That's pretty crazy.
So then when we discovered this pattern that occurred, we focused on a group that was called the Keating Gang, Keating, and they were out of St. Paul. And started digging into the historical records of that gang, and they began to check all the boxes. They checked all the boxes that I just shared with you as far as appearance, method of operation, the type of vehicles that they drove, and typically their times of day were very consistent as well. The Southside Bank robbery happened at 11 a.m. 2 others that were very similar happened between 10:15 and 10:30. Another happened between 9 a.m. and 9:15. But what was also very interesting is we were able to discover some phone records. And on the day before the Southside Bank robbery, one of the members of the Keating gang had placed a phone call to a relative in Wisconsin, just north of Green Bay. So was that a phone call to essentially say, hey, we're going to be in the area? I don't know. But I can tie him to Wisconsin, and I can tie him to their methods of operation, their appearance, their violence, not only their violence with police, but their violence inside the banks. They were very well known for beating the bank presidents and creating this very high level of violence to get people to essentially open the vaults and scare them into compliance. And that's how we found the Keating gang. And they ended up having some very nice booking photos that we were able to get copies of. And that booking photo was the one that I ultimately showed to my 91-year-old eyewitness at the time. And what was fascinating about the eyewitness interview was not only what he told me, but how he told it to me. He was able to put himself back in the scene to walk me right to the location where he was standing when he saw all this violence occur. And for him to have that recollection, which, you and I being retired cops, when trauma happens, you remember that shit. I mean, that stuff gets imprinted on your brain.
Yep.
And I have no doubt that this guy, 70 some years later, was recollecting something that he could vividly recall for the rest of his life. And when he was able to tell me confidently in his voice, where he said, I think you got him, I couldn't believe it, to be honest with you. To be able to say 70 some years later that I have an eyewitness who believes that is who he saw, that it's one of the men that he saw on that particular day. And I never intended for this to be a book, but the story became so fascinating that it was my first true crime book that I ended up writing.
So what is the title of the book?
It's called True Crime in Titletown, USA, Cold Cases.
Well,
and
I'm sorry, go ahead. No, please, go ahead.
And the original, it was originally produced by a publisher here in Wisconsin, and then it got sold to a different publisher who we ended up having a dispute with. So my goal someday is to be able to re-release it, but I have another story that I like to add to it. And myself and my wife, we have stumbled across another case, which is another historic cold case that we hope to write about someday, because it involves, again, just some interesting twists, some corruption here in Green Bay, some policing that was occurring back in the 1940s and 50s that involves some of the potential Chicago mobsters. And again, Green Bay known for what it's known for, right? The Green Bay Packers also has this pretty seedy side, and we hope to make it part of another story someday.
Well, that's exciting. So we'll obviously keep in touch. I want to hear more about that. I love his history. But to your point, there's a thing out there, a diagnosis called post-traumatic stress disorder, and with people who are thrown into combat, like in the military, or even I would say a lot of cops. I would even raise my hand. I've seen some really gnarly shit, man, and it haunts me to this day. Like I was doing a podcast on last week's episode where I talked about this suicidal young lady. I can remember every single freaking detail as if I were there yesterday, and this is probably 10 or 11 years ago. And so
right.
to bring in a witness who was in part of that, I mean, when you see machine gun fire and you're on scene like that, it's going to scar you, and it will be imprinted on your brain for the rest of your natural life. And so I have no doubt that this, even at 91 years old, it probably hit him like a ton of bricks, and he was like, holy shit, yeah, that's the guy.
Yes, no, I completely agree with you. As far as the PTSD, I raised my hand in that area as well. My second book that I wrote my second true crime book was called Ashley's Story. And I'm not so sure I shared this with you when we first met, but we had a daughter who was killed by a drunk driver. And I was working on the night that she was killed. I never responded to the scene, thank God, but it was still traumatic enough. And that book is called Ashley's Story. and you can view it on Amazon, and maybe that's for another, podcast someday. But when we go to those scenes and we live through such trauma, and we see the homicides and we see the violence that people impart upon one another, and God forbid if we ever have to take a life, and thank God I never had to, but it's something that never escapes you, and you have to learn to cope with it. You learn to live on, but it's a part of your brain that'll never be erased or never go away.
Yeah. Well, I had no clue that you'd lost a child to a drunk driver, man. That's horrific. So God bless you, brother, for staying sane. I'm not even sure if I could handle it. I have 2 kids of my own. I can't even imagine what that pain must have felt like. Well,
staying sane, I appreciate that, because sometimes that's questionable too.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I could. I sincerely, being a dad, I can't even imagine. So just keep up the good work. Keep us posted on the book. And so my understanding, your wife was a police officer as well. Is she still on the road, or is she retired as well?
No, she wasn't actually. My
she
wife
was
is
not. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's okay. My wife was she is a trained chef. So I'm a very well-fed man, and I get to eat amazing food. She makes it seem so easy. But we, when I retired, and shortly before retirement, there was a guy named Jerry Perrins, and Jerry Perrins was the first full-time security personnel for the Green Bay Packers organization. And he ultimately wrote a book about his experiences. But Jerry had a mother-in-law, so his wife's mom was murdered. And she is considered Green Bay's longest unsolved cold case as far as a missing person is concerned. And when I say murdered, we'll say presumed murdered, because she's never been found. And I'm very aware of her case. And Jerry Perrins was a police officer for the Green Bay Police Department back in the 50s and 60s, when shortly after his mother-in-law disappeared. And I have interviewed him extensively. And when I was interviewing him, he made me promise him that I would get Lisa involved in this case, because Jerry's also very involved in our family tragedy. He's very aware of it. So Lisa became my partner in crime. And I cannot tell you how important it is to have another perspective, not only the perspective of a wife, but of a woman who has lived with a cop for 30 years and, is able to give me different perspectives that I might miss. And to also kind of give that mother's perspective and that woman's perspective on things. And I think the next story that we're going to collaborate on is about Jerry Perrin's mother-in-law. And it's a fascinating expose. And we're hoping that as a result of the story, maybe we can solve the case.
Well, that's exciting, man. I wish you nothing but the best. I'm going to thank you so much for your time. I know it's a weekend for you. It's a Sunday afternoon, and you took your time out to be away from your family to be part of this podcast. So thank you very much. I'm certain that we'll be having you back in the near future. So thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
All right. You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, man, that was awesome. So listen up, guys. I want to thank you so much for being here. Make sure you like and subscribe. Go find us anywhere that you would find a podcast. You can find us on iTunes and Spotify. We have a YouTube channel now, Instagram page. My wife even created a TikTok profile. I never thought I'd be saying that, but we have a TikTok for the channel as well. Make sure you like and subscribe. Find us there. And until next time, God bless each and every one of you, and we'll catch you on the next one. Take care.
Never imagined a love like yours. Through all the endless nights, you were the one I was searching for, looking for the one that was worth it. Yeah, and all this time you were right here by my side.